Good morning. After all this time studying the life of Jesus in the book of Mark, starting in April of 2023, we finally arrived today at the cross. So you know me, I like to kind of joke around some and play around, but there's no play in here. There's no joke in here. This is heavy and it's serious. If you've been with us for the last few weeks, you've been studying with us through the heaviest moments of Jesus leading up to the cross. That Thursday night when he was sweating blood and taken from the garden. That night when he was standing in that fake trial before the Sanhedrin, and then where he spent the night in that pit. It was early the next morning where they removed him and he stood trial before Pilate, and then he was sent to Herod, rejected, and then back to Pilate again. Mark doesn't show us the Herod part, just the Pilate part. And we looked last week at how Pilate asked that question, what even is truth? Such a profound question. The kind of question that for us leads us to choose the wrong son of the wrong father over the true son of the Father, the Bar Abbas instead of the Jesus. And that's what happened. The people chose wrongly, and Pilate condemned Jesus to death. So it's immediately after this pronouncement that we pick up the story today in Mark 15, verse 16. The soldiers led him away inside the palace, that is the governor's headquarters. So this is what's called the praetorium. It's where the governor's residence was. It's where Pilate lived. They led him away from Pilate, and they took him down to be scourged and to be mocked. I wish I could take you there. We've had the chance to be at the praetorium. Oh, wait, time out. Sorry, give me a second. I forgot to tell you something really important. This heavy thing that we're talking about today, it's the crucifixion of Jesus. And I can't deal with it in one simple hour. So I'm doing this message in two parts, and I forgot to tell you about it. Today, I'm going to be talking about what happened historically, what happened chronologically, what happened factually at the cross. And I'll be talking about a little bit of its biblical and theological context. But next time, part 2 of this message is going to be what happened at the cross theologically. So today we're going to look at the facts, and next time we will look at what it all really, truly means. Is that okay? Okay. So Jesus is being led away to the praetorium. We had a chance to go to this spot when we visited Israel last. You walk through the city streets there in Jerusalem. They aren't big, wide highways. They're narrow streets. And you come to the courtyard of the praetorium, but this isn't the first century courtyard because it's the 21st century. The original one is down below, now underground. So you have to go down beneath because Jerusalem has been plundered, rebuilt. So all the old stuff from the first century is down below. Depending on your tour guide, some of them tell you that these were the original stones. These were the first century stones. Some say that Hadrian came through and replaced them in about 150 AD, but many of the scholars believe that he did that everywhere in Jerusalem except here, because they were pristine at the time, being the governor's residence. And so these would have been the very stones that Jesus was beaten and his blood would have spilled on right here. It's a powerful time to go and to stand in that place and to see those stones. This is where he was scourged. You know, you think about scourging, he was whipped. And so we think about those long leather whips where you whip it around and you yank it back so it pops real good, and I mean, you don't even like it when you get popped with a wet towel, let alone a leather whip. But Jesus didn't get whipped with that type of whip. The type of whip that he would have been beaten with was called a Roman flagrum. We call it the cat of nine tails. This is a decorative one, but it would have looked a lot like this, a wooden handle with shorter, multiple ropes coming out of it. And down here where you see the metal tied in, Jesus' Roman flagrum would have had bits of lead and glass. And the purpose of this device, I think, is way crueler than the purpose of a whip that you normally think of. Because this was up close and personal. These strands are fairly short, maybe about 3 feet long. And the purpose of them was to hit the victim and for them to wrap around and grab the flesh. Those bits of glass and lead to dig into the flesh, and then they would yank it out, literally tearing the flesh off of the victim. And, we tend to think of, Jesus must have gotten 39 lashes because that was the tradition. It's 40 minus 1. That shows God's mercy somehow. But that was a Jewish tradition, not a Roman tradition. They beat these guys mercilessly. They whipped them mercilessly. And Josephus, the modern-day to Jesus historian, talks about how the criminals that underwent this torture, they had the skin ripped away, exposing their muscles, their blood vessels, sometimes their internal organs exposed underneath. And he tells us that most of the criminals beaten in this way did not survive the beating and never even made it to their actual crucifixion. Jesus' body is literally shredded, his back looking more like hamburger meat than a human back. So he is torn to shreds by the Romans here at the Praetorium in this horrible, horrible way, fulfilling what Isaiah the prophet said in Isaiah 53. He was pierced for our rebellion, crushed for our sins. He was beaten so that we could be whole. He was whipped so we could be healed. All of us, like sheep, have strayed away. We've left God's paths to follow our own, yet the Lord laid on him the sins of us all. So they've beaten Jesus, and now it's time to mock him. So verse 16 says they called together the whole battalion. So the Greek word here is not battalion. Battalion is a later word. The word here, Greek word, is the word spira, and it means a detachment of 480 soldiers ruled or overseen by one centurion. So it's a centurion and 480 soldiers. And remember what was going on here. They always had a Roman presence in Jerusalem, but in this particular case, it's Passover. Passover is the time where people come from all over the known world back to Jerusalem to celebrate together. All the Jews would come back to Jerusalem for the Passover, and Jerusalem would go from being a good-sized town to a huge city during that time because of all the people that were traveling back. And so Rome made it their practice every year to send an extra spira, an extra 480 men to Jerusalem. They were normally stationed up by the Mediterranean Sea at Caesarea Philippi. That's where Pilate was normally stationed also, but they were in Jerusalem to make sure everything stayed peaceful as much as possible. So there's an extra 480 soldiers there in town, and they called a whole battalion together. I think Mark is using an expression. I don't think they put 480 people. You couldn't put 480 people in the Praetorium. You just couldn't get them all in. I think he's saying that they called everybody they could find, all the soldiers they could find. Hey, come here. You got to see this. You got to see this guy. Come look at this pathetic awful excuse for a Messiah. Of course, they all wanted to come and mock him. They hated the Jews. They hated being there. They were used to their Roman, sophisticated, city, urban lifestyle, which they loved, but their assignment was this backwater Palestine place where these people, they thought they were going to control the world on God's behalf, but they couldn't control themselves. Crazy people always fighting with themselves. Backwater rednecks. And now it was even worse because normally they were up by the sea, the beautiful, beautiful Mediterranean Sea in the fantastic palace there. And now they had been sent on detachment into the interior, down near the desert where it was just hot all the time and no breeze, no break. And just, good grief, these people, these crazy people, and it's crowded, and there's always factions fighting with each other, and now here's the king of all of them. Oh, they just were ready to mock and revile him. So they called together the whole battalion to do just that, and in verse 17, they clothed him in a purple cloak, and twisting together a crown of thorns, they put it on him. And they began to salute him. Hail, King of the Jews! And they were striking his head with a reed and spitting on him and kneeling down in homage, in fake homage to him. I want to kind of unpack all this just a little bit, just so you know. They clothed him in a purple cloak. Probably had an old Roman soldier cloak, probably a faded one, and they put it on him. And I would imagine, they've put it on this back that's just been literally shredded. And I would imagine they put it on him and they just patted it in real good. I bet he was bleeding through the cloak as it was on his back. Every pat must have sent pain all throughout his body. Mocking him, purple meaning royalty. And they twisted together a crown of thorns. We had the privilege of being just outside the city walls of Jerusalem, and we got to see some of the natural indigenous thorn bushes there. And you can see them kind of blowing in the slight breeze that was blowing up the side of that mountain. And they were really shockingly amazing. We happened to be there when the attendant for the local monastery, or whatever it was, came out and began to trim the outside branches of the bush there. And we were like, hey, can we have some of your trash? Can we have some of a clipping or two? And he sent us back with the end of one of those bushes. And my wife wanted me to remind you that this is the end, the outside end, where it's kind of thin and narrow and small. You get down on in near the stalk, and they were thicker and heavier and longer. Can't imagine twisting this and pressing it in on his head. That's how cruel they were after shredding his back, his body. They twisted that crown of thorns together, put it on him, and they were just mercilessly mocking him. Don't know how long they mocked him for. Hail, King of the Jews. I mean, there was probably a lot of them there, and they probably all took turns spitting, kicking, patting him on the back, kneeling, and hail, King of the Jews. But afterwards, in verse 20, when they had mocked him, they stripped him of the purple cloak and put his own clothes on him, and they led him out to crucify him. I heard somebody talking about this once, and they wondered how long the mocking lasted. Was it long enough for the blood to kind of begin to congeal in that cloak so that when they ripped it off him, it was yet again more awful, horrible pain. What must it have been like? They led him out to crucify him. We know from the other Gospels that he was carrying his cross. Mark doesn't give us any detail. Probably not carrying the whole cross, probably carrying the cross beam, the cross part of the cross. Can you imagine him carrying that on that shredded back and shoulders? The agony that he must have been dealing with, on top of the fact that he had just been beaten the night before and then spent the night standing in that bad water in the pit, not sleeping at all night long, alone, and then been beaten and mocked and all that he went through, and now he's got to carry that crossbeam. He makes it part of the way. Mark doesn't give us really hardly any detail about it at all. He makes it part of the way, but Matthew tells us that he stumbles and is unable to continue carrying his cross. So Mark tells us in verse 21 that they compelled a passerby, Simon of Cyrene, who was coming from the country, the father of Alexander and Rufus. They compelled Simon to carry his cross. This is kind of unlike Mark. He isn't giving us so much. He's skipping so much detail, yet we know the name of this man, where he's from, and the names of his two boys. Why would Mark stop for just a second and give us this detail when he skips so much other detail? We know that Simon was from Cyrene. That means he's from Africa. And we know there was a couple of different pockets of Jewish communities in Africa. So he was traveling into Jerusalem for Passover like all Jewish people were. So this would have been an African Jew, and so he mentions his name and the names of his two boys. We don't know. We don't know what happened to Simon or either of his two boys. But there is some speculation. In Romans, Paul addresses a few people by name. One of them, his name is Rufus. And Paul says to make sure you greet Rufus and his dear mother. So he mentions Rufus and a mom, but not Alexander and Simon. And there are scholars that speculate, it's just speculation, that this could be the Rufus, and the reason that Mark mentions Rufus. To be able to say, hey, you know this guy. You've heard his story. You may not have met Simon. He may have died earlier, hence mentioning mom, not dad. But Mark is saying here, you know these guys. The scholars speculate that it was Alexander and Rufus who may have gone around the known world at the time sharing their story of how they, as young boys, watched their dad carry the cross of Jesus. And Rufus may have just ended up in Rome still telling his story. So Mark is oddly specific there, and all we can really do is speculate. All we really know is that Simon carries the cross all the way to Golgotha. Verse 22, they brought him to the place called Golgotha, which means place of a skull. This is the English Standard Version. You've probably seen it translated place of the skull. The Greek is not specific. The Greek here, it just says skull place. So the English translators can say what they want, place of the skull, place of a skull. They brought him to the place called Golgotha. So when you're there in Israel, there are two sites that are candidates for being the biblical Golgotha. We like the Protestant site the best. We really prefer it. It's beautiful because that site is a garden with a garden tomb. You've seen the images of the garden tomb. And there is a hill very nearby where there's a formation that looks a little bit like a skull. You can see this is an older picture. It's not one that I took because now there's buildings all up here on the top. And so I just kind of like this older picture a little bit better. And it's this area right here that they're really focused in on that seems to maybe resemble a skull. At the time, unlike today, at the time of Jesus, this location would have been just outside the old city walls of Jerusalem. And there was a highly trafficked road that went right along here at the base of this hill. So you would come out the city gate, and then you would come right through here. There's a big crossroads. Everybody traveled this direction all the time. Some people suggest that the crosses could have been up on the top of the hill, maybe. But others suggest it could have been at the bottom, at the base, because they wanted them by the road. The Romans wanted you to see it, and they wanted you to smell it. They wanted you to know how painful it would be for you if you disobeyed Rome. Not only that, but the scriptures describe people walking by and shaking their heads and spitting on the people crucified. So that would tend to lead me to believe that if it was this location, they would have been at the bottom. You also can walk from here through the garden to the garden tomb. It's a beautiful, peaceful sight, and we prefer it. But scientifically, archaeologically, it's not the site. We're pretty confident that it's actually the second site, the Catholic site, that is the actual site where Jesus was crucified and buried. And like so many Catholic sites, they've built a huge, ornate church over the location. So from the Praetorium, you walk through the narrow streets of Jerusalem. And just past this, you turn onto the Via Dolorosa, which is a crowded, full street of people going from one shop to another. It's a marketplace today, just like it was then. Jesus is carrying his cross through this area, and we arrived at the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which is the church built over the site now. And you go in there, and it's really kind of an enormous, complex building. The crucifixion in Golgotha was this way, and the sepulcher is this way. This is the sepulcher, the site of the burial and resurrection of Jesus. It's really kind of an amazing experience to go there and to be able to see all of this. But it doesn't feel, you can see, it doesn't feel like the garden site that the Protestants have preserved. So they take Jesus to Golgotha, and when they arrive, verse 23, they offered him wine mixed with myrrh, but he did not take it. And they crucified him and divided his garments among them, casting lots for them to decide what each should take. It was the third hour, meaning 9 o'clock in the morning-ish, when they crucified him. And the inscription of the charge against him, which they wrote and they mounted onto the cross above his head, read, "The King of the Jews." It's interesting that Mark again skips so many details. He doesn't even mention nails. Mark doesn't even talk about it. We always think of the nails, don't we? When we think of the cross, we can't help but think of the nails. And I know when you see the paintings of Jesus on the cross, there's always nails in his palms. But we know that was not the case, right? Why would they not have driven nails in his palms? Exactly. There's no real significant bones in here to bear the weight of a human body, so his hand would have ripped right off of the nail and he would have fallen off the cross. So we know from archaeology and from basic common sense that the Greek word for hand, it really means elbow to fingertip. That's your hand when you're in Greek. And so everything, including archaeological discoveries, show that they actually drove the nail into his wrist, between these bones, just underneath his wrist, which would easily hold the weight of a person. So a nail in each wrist and one nail through both feet. When a criminal hung on the cross, they hung with their knees bent and their weight on their arms. This puts pressure on the lungs. And believe it or not, when you're crucified, you're not dying because you bleed out. You're dying because you suffocate, because you just can't breathe. So what they would do is they would be bent, their knees would be bent, and they would push themselves up, and they would gasp for air before they couldn't hold themselves up any longer, and then they would relax back down again and just be able to breathe a little bit. It was a horrible, horrible death. And then Mark gives us this paragraph, verse 27. And with him, they crucified two robbers, one on his right and one on his left. No mention really of the dialogue that Jesus has with the robbers. And those who passed by derided him, wagging their heads and saying, "Aha! You who would destroy the temple and rebuild it in 3 days, save yourself and come down from the cross." So also the chief priests with the scribes mocked him to one another, saying, "He saved others, but he can't save himself. Let the Christ, the King of Israel, come down now from the cross, that we may see and believe." Isn't this amazing? They wanted him to come down so they would believe, but we believe because he stayed put. Those who were crucified with him also reviled him. So Mark again leaves out a lot of detail, but I want you to make sure you get the picture he's drawing. Everyone he mentions in this passage, everyone who is witnessing the crucifixion for Mark, everyone, robbers, passersby, chief priests, scribes, everyone he mentions hate Jesus now. Everyone reviles him, hates him. Everyone believes he got what was coming to him. Everybody is reviling him and disgusted by him. For these people, when they see Jesus on the cross, they believe he's there because he deserves it. He's there because he's wrong. He's there because he's bad. He's there because he's evil. Justice reigns and he gets punished for what he did. And now what Mark is showing us is that the hatred of the world is all coming against Jesus. He paints the picture of nobody empathizing with Jesus. Everyone now only sees him as defeated. And then in verse 33, when the 6th hour had come, that's noon-ish, when the 6th hour had come, there was darkness over the whole land until the 9th hour. And that's all Mark says about that. 3 hours of darkness. Mark doesn't say, it doesn't describe people looking around trying to figure out what's going on. He doesn't say why it's dark. He doesn't give any explanation or description. It's just dark for 3 hours, and then he moves on. And so a lot of discussion. I read a lot of writing about these 3 hours. What could happen? Some have suggested it could have been an eclipse. Scientifically, though, that's really impossible. Passover only happens at a full moon. So in relation to Earth, that means the sun and the moon are opposite each other. So scientifically, it could not have been an eclipse. The moon would have had to race around the other side real fast. Not only that, but an eclipse lasts minutes. Darkness in an eclipse lasts minutes, not hours. So what is this? Is it a global darkness? Is it a local darkness? What's going on here? Mark doesn't tell us, and he doesn't care. Mark isn't interested in telling us what it happens. He just wants you to know that it happens, because for Mark and for all of the early readers of this gospel, darkness means something. For Mark and for all of those original readers, darkness means judgment. God's judgment. So he's just given us a paragraph about how the world's judgment is against him. Everybody hates him now. And Mark is also showing us that God is also against him now. Judgment is happening just as God promised. Old Testament prophet Amos, hundreds of years earlier, said on behalf of God, in that day, I will make the sun go down at noon and darken the earth while it is still day. I will turn your celebrations into times of mourning and your singing into weeping. And you'll wear funeral clothes and you'll shave your heads to show your sorrow as if your only son had died. How very bitter that day will be. And 3 hours of darkness shows that this is a very bitter day. So the 3 hours goes by, and in verse 34, at the 9th hour, Jesus cried with a loud voice, Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani, which means, my God, why have you forsaken me? And some of the bystanders hearing it said, behold, he's calling Elijah. Here he said, Eloi, Eloi, that must mean Elijah. He's calling Elijah. And someone ran and filled a sponge with sour wine and put it on a reed and gave it to him to drink, saying, wait, let us see whether Elijah will come and take him down. I don't think they misunderstood him. I think they knew exactly what he was saying. He was speaking in Aramaic. That's why Mark translates it. He writes it in Aramaic, and then he translates it for us. Eloi, Eloi, lema sabachthani means, my God, why have you forsaken me? I think everybody knew what he said, but they're just mocking him mercilessly. Oh, listen, he must be calling for Elijah. Let's keep him alive just a little longer. Let's give him something to drink. Let's just keep him alive a few more minutes, and let's see whether Elijah will actually come and take this sorry loser down. They are mocking him. Let's see if Elijah comes. Jesus here is actually taking part in something far, far greater, far, far deeper than his immediate suffering. And he's proving it to us here. What he's doing here is he's quoting a very prominent messianic psalm that they all would have known. It's Psalm 22. Here's a few verses from Psalm 22. My God, why have you forsaken me? Or why have you abandoned me? Why are you so far away when I groan for help? But I'm a worm and not a man. I'm scorned and despised by all. Everyone who sees me mocks me. They sneer and shake their heads, saying, is this the one that relies on the Lord? Then let the Lord save him. If the Lord loves him so much, let the Lord rescue him. My life is poured out like water, and all my bones are out of joint. My heart is like wax melting within me. My strength is dried up like sun-baked clay. My tongue sticks to the roof of my mouth. You've laid me in the dust and you've left me for dead. My enemies surround me like a pack of dogs. An evil gang closes in on me. They've pierced my hands and feet. I can count all my bones. My enemies stare at me and gloat. They divide my garments among themselves and throw dice for my clothing. I think it was very clear to everyone who heard him what he was saying. And rather than choosing to see what he was saying, they chose to mock. And then in verse 37, Jesus uttered a loud cry and breathed his last. It's fascinating to me. In Mark, we don't have any record at all of any of the words of Jesus on the cross. I'm looking back through them now. We don't have any record of what he says. We know that he spoke at least 7 times from the cross. We have a record of 7 of those times, and we know what he said, some very profound things from the cross. But Mark shows us none of those things. Those things don't really matter in the context of what Mark is trying to show you. So Jesus utters a loud cry and he breathed his last. And in verse 38, here's what Mark wants you to see. Jesus dies, and then the curtain of the temple was torn in two from top to bottom. Again, Mark isn't giving us the detail like Matthew gives. Matthew talks about an earthquake and a thunderclap. He talks about how graves broke open and zombies came out and walked the streets of Jerusalem and everybody saw it. He talks about all kinds of stuff, but Mark doesn't show us that. He wants us to see this one thing. Jesus dies and the temple curtain was torn in two. Why does he want us to see this? Because for all of Jewish history, God has lived behind a curtain. There is separation between God and humans because humans are unholy and we don't dare approach the presence of God. That's why he lives in a temple behind a curtain. And God is so holy and we are so unholy that only the holiest of all of the holy priests are allowed to go in to the temple. The holiest one, the high priest. Only he dares go in that temple, and then he only dares go in there once a year. And then he only dares go in there once his own sins have been purified. He goes through a period of fasting and prayer and cleansing, both physically and spiritually, before he even comes close to going behind that curtain. And when he goes in there, they tie a rope around his ankle just so in case God kills him, they can pull his dead body back out again. And Mark is showing us here that Jesus breathes his last breath, and then suddenly this 60-foot tall, 30-foot wide, 4-inch thick veil is ripped in two. The separation is now over. Judgment has been pronounced, and we, because Jesus breathed his last, we now can be one with him. Now there is no condemnation for those who are in Christ Jesus. Amen? Mark kind of reiterates that here. I think the great climactic statement of Mark isn't Jesus breathing his last. I think it is this, that the curtain of the temple was torn in two, and that when the centurion in verse 39 saw what was happening, saw that in this way he breathed his last, he said, truly this man was the Son of God. The highest Roman official present, the person who more than anybody at that site represented the kingdom of this world, speaks the truth and identifies Jesus as the Son of God. This is the climactic statement for Mark, that the Son of God would take the judgment of God and remove the separation between us and God. This is what the cross is all about. Remember the reed that they beat him with at the Praetorium? Remember that? So when I think of a reed, I think of that thing that grows in a pond, So, I think of just you smacking him with the reed. What does that even mean? But I did some research, and that reed it's not a bamboo reed, but it's like a bamboo reed. And Mark doesn't tell us, but Matthew does, that before they beat him with it, they put the crown of thorns on his head, and they put that purple robe on his back, and they placed the reed in his right hand, representing what? What? Representing his kingly scepter. And then they immediately yanked it out of his hand, and they began to hit him over the head with that reed. I think this is what the cross is really all about. The very instrument of the king's authority is what is immediately used to judge the son of the king. In other words, there is no hypocrisy in God at all. There's no sense of being arbitrary in God at all. The Son of God is judged by his own rules. He's judged by his own level of holiness. He didn't deserve it and he didn't earn it, but remember, he's there on my behalf. He stands in that praetorium and he hangs on that cross representing me, taking the punishment that I deserved, fulfilling what it said in Isaiah, that he was beaten for our transgressions. All we like sheep have gone astray. Each of us have turned to his own way, but the Lord has laid on him the iniquity, the sins of us all. Paul says so much in 2 Corinthians 5:21. He says that God made Christ, who never sinned, to be the offering for our sin, so that we could be made right with God through Christ. That's what the cross is all about. It's about him standing in for me, taking what I deserved. And it's horrible. It's painful. It's enough to make me choke up and have a hard time getting through this message. It's the worst day of human history. But I'm so grateful. I'm so grateful that he did that for me. I'm so grateful that today I can be free from my past. I can be free from my sin. I can be free from my shame and my guilt. And I can be free because of what he did for me. Amen? Let's pray together.